The debt collector's knock came 3 days after they buried her father, and Zelda Carmichael knew before she opened the door that everything was about to change forever. She stood in the doorway of their small cabin outside Coloma, California, her hands still wrinkled from washing her father's death clothes, and listened to a weasel-faced man in a checkered suit explain that her father owed $3,000 to a man named Marcus Holloway, and since she was his only living heir, the debt now belonged to her. The year was 1878, and the gold rush days that had made Coloma famous were long gone, leaving behind only desperate people scraping by on what little remained. "I cannot pay this," Zelda said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "We have nothing. The mine has been dry for 2 years." The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Holloway anticipated this problem. He has generously offered to purchase your labor contract. 7 years of work at his ranch will settle the debt entirely." 7 years. The words came out as a whisper. She was 22 years old. 7 years might as well be a lifetime. "The alternative is prison, Miss Carmichael. Debtor's prison is not kind to young women." He pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Sign here, and you will report to the Holloway Ranch tomorrow morning." Her hand shook as she signed her name, each letter feeling like a betrayal of everything her father had tried to build in this harsh land. He had been a good man, her father, but he had also been a gambler, and his final bet had cost his daughter her freedom. The Holloway Ranch sprawled across a valley 20 miles east of Coloma, an empire of cattle and cruelty that everyone in the territory knew to avoid. Marcus Holloway was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s with gray shot through his black beard and eyes that looked at people like they were livestock to be appraised and used. When Zelda arrived the next morning with her single bag of belongings, he walked around her in a slow circle, examining her like she was a horse he was considering buying. "You will work in the house," he said finally. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever my wife requires. You will also work in the stables when needed. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not leave this ranch without permission. You try to run, and I will have the law on you so fast your head will spin. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The words tasted like ashes. His wife, Eleanor, was a thin woman with a pinched face who looked at Zelda with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of a shoe. She showed Zelda to a tiny room off the kitchen that was barely large enough for the narrow cot inside it. "You will rise at 4, Eleanor said. "Breakfast must be ready by 5. Mr. Holloway does not tolerate lateness." The first week passed in a blur of exhaustion. Zelda woke before dawn to build the fire and prepare breakfast for the family and the dozen ranch hands who worked the property. She scrubbed floors until her knees were bruised and her hands were raw. She hauled water from the well until her shoulders ached. And through it all, Marcus Holloway watched her with eyes that made her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that went beyond simple servitude. On the 8th day, she was mucking out stalls in the stable when one of the ranch hands, a burly man named Dutch, cornered her in the shadows. He smelled of sweat and tobacco, and when he grabbed her arm, his fingers dug in hard enough to bruise. "Pretty little thing like you should be friendlier to the men who work here," he said, his breath hot on her face. Zelda drove her knee up as hard as she could, and when Dutch doubled over with a strangled curse, she ran. She made it halfway across the yard before Marcus Holloway stepped out of the house and blocked her path. "Problem?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. He tried to. She could not make herself finish the sentence. Holloway looked past her to where Dutch was still bent over, gasping. Then he looked back at Zelda, and she saw something flicker in his eyes that was somehow worse than the threat Dutch had posed. "Dutch," Holloway called out, "get back to work." He said nothing about what had happened. He offered no protection, no reassurance. He simply turned and walked back into the house, and Zelda understood with perfect clarity that she was utterly alone here. The next 3 weeks were a special kind of hell. Dutch watched her with murder in his eyes, waiting for another chance. Alina found fault with everything Zelda did, adding extra tasks as punishment for imagined infractions. And Marcus Holloway continued his silent observation, his presence a constant weight that made her feel like a rabbit being stalked by a wolf. Then came the morning when everything changed again. She was in the kitchen, up to her elbows in bread dough, when she heard raised voices from Holloway's office. A man was arguing with the rancher, his voice deep and calm despite the anger in Holloway's responses. "The contract is not for sale," Holloway said. "Everything is for sale." The other man's voice carried an edge of steel beneath the calm. "You paid $2,000 for it. I am offering $3,000. Why would you pay extra for a labor contract on some nobody girl? That is my business. Do we have a deal or not?" There was a long silence, and Zelda found herself holding her breath, her hands frozen in the dough. Someone was trying to buy her contract. The question was whether that would make things better or worse. $3,000, Holloway said finally. "Cash. Done." Zelda heard the clink of coins, the rustle of papers being exchanged. Then footsteps approached the kitchen, and Marcus Holloway appeared in the doorway with a stranger behind him. The stranger was tall, over 6 feet, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that brushed his collar. He wore working clothes, dusty from travel, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray as storm clouds and startlingly direct as they met hers. "Get your things," Holloway said to her. "Your contract has been sold." Zelda's heart lurched. "Sold? To who?" "To me," the stranger said. His voice was quieter than she expected, almost gentle. "My name is Thomas Kane. I have a ranch about 30 miles northwest of here. You will work there now." She wanted to ask questions, wanted to demand answers, but Holloway was already gesturing impatiently toward her room. She wiped the dough from her hands and went to gather her few belongings, her mind racing. Was this better? Worse? Would Thomas Kane be another Marcus Holloway, another man who saw her as property to be used? When she emerged with her bag, Thomas Kane was waiting alone in the yard, holding the reins of 2 horses. He gestured to the smaller mare. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Good, we have a long way to go." They rode in silence for the first hour, leaving the Holloway ranch behind as they climbed into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The September sun was warm on Zelda's shoulders, and despite her fear and uncertainty, she felt something loosen in her chest with every mile they put between her and that awful place. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke. "Why did you buy my contract?" Thomas glanced over at her, and she caught a glimpse of something in his expression that might have been sympathy. "I heard about what was happening at the Holloway ranch. I heard he had bought a labor contract on a woman. That did not sit right with me. So you bought it instead?" "I did." "And now I work for you." She tried to keep the bitterness from her voice and failed. "No." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded paper, the contract that bound her to 7 years of servitude. He held it out to her. "Now you are free." Zelda stared at the paper, not understanding. "What? Take it," he said. "It is yours. You can burn it, tear it up, whatever you want. The debt is paid. You do not owe me anything." She took the paper with trembling hands, unfolded it, and saw her signature at the bottom, the terms of her bondage spelled out in black ink. "I do not understand. You paid $3,000 for this. Why would you just give it to me?" Thomas looked straight ahead at the trail, his jaw tight. "My mother was sold into a labor contract when I was a boy. She died before she could work it off. I swore then that if I ever had the means, I would help someone else escape that fate. He turned to look at her again, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her breath catch. You are free, Zelda Carmichael. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want. I will take you to Sacramento, or back to Coloma, or anywhere else. Just say the word. Zelda looked down at the contract in her hands, at the words that had defined her as property, as something to be bought and sold. Then she looked at the man beside her, this stranger who had spent a fortune to free someone he had never met. I have nowhere to go, she said quietly. My father is dead. I have no other family. If I go back to Coloma, the creditors will find me again, and next time it might be worse than Holloway. She met his eyes. If the offer stands, I would like to work for you, not because of a contract, but because I choose to, for fair wages and honest treatment. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening around his eyes. The offer stands. I could use help at the ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, is getting on in years and the work is hard for her. I can pay you $20 a month plus room and board. You can leave whenever you want, no questions asked. $20 a month was more than fair, more than generous even. Zelda felt tears prick at her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since her father's death. Thank you, she whispered. Thomas reached across the space between their horses and took the contract from her hands. Then, in one smooth motion, he struck a match against his saddle and held it to the corner of the paper. They watched together as the flames consumed the document, turning her bondage to ashes that scattered on the wind. The Kane Ranch was smaller than Holloway's spread, nestled in a green valley with a creek running through it and mountains rising in the distance. The house was built of good timber, solid and well-maintained, with a wide porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. Behind it stood a barn, a stable and a bunkhouse for the handful of men Thomas employed. Mrs. Chen turned out to be a brisk Chinese woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a kind smile. She took one look at Zelda, thin and exhausted from her time at the Holloway ranch, and immediately set about feeding her. Too skinny, Mrs. Chen declared, ladling soup into a bowl. You eat, then you rest. Work can wait until tomorrow. The room Mrs. Chen showed her to was small but clean, with a real bed and a window overlooking the valley. After the closet-sized space at Holloway's, it felt like a palace. Zelda sat on the edge of the bed and let herself cry for the first time in weeks, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. She had been so afraid. She had been so certain that her life was over, that she would spend 7 years being ground down until there was nothing left of the person she had been. And then, Thomas Kane had appeared like something out of a story and given her back her freedom with no strings attached. It seemed too good to be true. Some part of her kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Thomas to reveal his true intentions, for this all to be some elaborate trick. But as the days passed and she settled into the rhythm of work at the ranch, that fear slowly began to ease. Thomas treated her with the same quiet respect he showed everyone who worked for him. He was not a talker, she discovered. He was a man who expressed himself through actions rather than words. When he noticed her struggling to carry heavy water buckets, he rigged up a pulley system to make the work easier. When Mrs. Chen mentioned that Zelda had no proper work dresses, he rode into Coloma and returned with fabric and thread. When one of his ranch hands made a comment that could have been interpreted as inappropriate, Thomas's quiet word in the man's ear ensured it never happened again. He was also, Zelda could not help but notice, handsome in a rough-hewn way that made her heart do foolish things when he smiled. Not that he smiled often, but when he did, it transformed his whole face, softening the hard lines that outdoor work and mountain living had carved there. She tried to ignore the growing warmth she felt when he was near. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she was confusing gratitude with something else. But the truth was harder to deny with each passing day. A month after she arrived at the ranch, Thomas taught her to shoot. "Every woman living this far from town should know how to handle a gun," he said, setting up targets in the field behind the barn. "I am not always here, and neither are the ranch hands. You should be able to protect yourself." He stood behind her to show her the proper stance, his hands gentle as he adjusted her grip on the pistol. And Zelda was suddenly, acutely aware of how close he was, the warmth of his body at her back, the smell of leather and soap, and something else that was uniquely him. "Focus on the target," he said, his voice low near her ear. "Take a breath, let half of it out, then squeeze the trigger gently. Do not pull, squeeze." She did as he instructed and was startled when the gun kicked in her hand and the bottle they had set up as a target exploded in a shower of glass. "Good," Thomas said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even though she could not see his face. "Very good. Again." They spent an hour practicing, and by the end, Zelda could hit the target more often than not. Thomas seemed genuinely pleased, and the warmth of his approval settled around her heart like a blanket. That night, lying in bed and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep, Zelda admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny. She was falling for Thomas Kane. Maybe she had been falling for him since that moment in Holloway's yard when he had handed her the contract and told her she was free. It was foolish, she told herself. He had done a kind thing, but that did not mean he felt anything for her beyond basic human decency. He was a rancher, a property owner, a man of means. She was a woman who had nearly been destroyed by debt and servitude. They came from different worlds, but the heart, she was learning, did not care much about logic. October brought cooler weather and the first hints of the winter to come. The work at the ranch shifted as they prepared for the cold months, stocking the root cellar and cutting firewood, and making sure the outbuildings were secure against snow and wind. Zelda worked alongside Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands, learning the rhythms of ranch life, feeling herself grow stronger and more confident with each passing day. She also spent more time with Thomas, often by accident, but sometimes, she suspected, by his design. He would find reasons to work near wherever she was. He would invite her to ride out with him to check on the cattle, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the valley. He would linger in the kitchen after dinner, nursing a cup of coffee and talking with her and Mrs. Chen about everything and nothing. And sometimes, she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something tender and almost uncertain, as if he too was wrestling with feelings he did not quite know how to handle. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that made the valley look like it had been sprinkled with sugar. Zelda stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl, watching the sun rise over the white landscape, and felt something close to contentment settle over her. Beautiful, is it not? She turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered her one and she took it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. "It is," she agreed. "I have never seen snow before. It only rained in Coloma when I lived there." "You were born there." "No, I was born in San Francisco. My mother died when I was very young and my father brought me to Coloma when I was 6. He thought we would strike it rich in the gold fields," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. Obviously, that did not work out. Thomas was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. Then he said, "My father was a miner too. He died in a cave-in when I was 12. My mother tried to keep us afloat, but the debts were too much. That is when she was forced to sign the labor contract." His voice was carefully neutral, but Zelda could hear the old pain beneath it. She worked herself to death trying to pay it off. I was 16 when she died. I am sorry, Zelda said softly. It was a long time ago. He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. But it is why I could not leave you at the Holloway ranch. I know what men like him do to women they have power over. I could not let that happen to you. You saved my life, Zelda said. You know that, do you not? A few more weeks in that place and I do not know if I would have survived. You are stronger than you think. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek, and Zelda felt heat spread through her despite the cold morning air. I saw that strength the first time I looked at you. It is one of the things I admire most about you. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. One of the things, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I admire a great many things about you, Zelda Carmichael. Before she could respond, before she could process what was happening, Mrs. Chen called from inside that breakfast was ready and the moment broke. Thomas stepped back, his hand dropping to his side, but the warmth in his eyes remained. They went inside to eat, and Zelda's mind was spinning. He had almost said something important. She was sure of it. And the way he had touched her face, so gentle and careful as if she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. The days that followed were charged with a new tension, awareness crackling between them like electricity before a storm. They circled each other carefully, neither quite brave enough to take the next step, both afraid of what it might mean. Then came the night that changed everything. Zelda woke to the sound of shouting and the acrid smell of smoke. She stumbled from her bed, still half asleep, and threw open her door to find the hallway filled with gray haze. Fire. The barn was on fire. She ran outside in her nightdress, not even stopping to grab shoes or a coat. The barn was fully engulfed, flames leaping 30 feet into the night sky, and Thomas was running toward it even as the ranch hands tried to pull him back. "The horses," he shouted. "They are still inside." He disappeared into the smoke before anyone could stop him, and Zelda felt her heart stop. She ran forward without thinking, but strong arms caught her around the waist. "Let me go," she screamed, fighting against whoever held her. "He will die in there." "And you will die too if you go in," Mrs. Chen said, her voice tight with fear. "We can do nothing but wait." The seconds stretched into an eternity. Zelda could hear the terrified screaming of the horses, the roar of the flames, the shouts of the men trying to set up a bucket brigade from the creek. And then, through the smoke and chaos, she saw Thomas emerge leading 2 of the horses, their eyes rolling white with terror. "Get them clear," he gasped, and then he was running back into the inferno. He made 3 trips, bringing out 2 horses each time until all 6 were safe. On the final trip, part of the barn roof collapsed behind him, sending up a shower of sparks and a blast of heat that knocked him to his knees. The ranch hands rushed forward to drag him clear as the rest of the structure gave way with a sound like the end of the world. Zelda was at his side in an instant, her hands running over him frantically, checking for injuries. His face was black with soot, his eyebrows singed, and his hands were badly burned where he had gripped hot bridles and ropes. "You fool," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You absolute fool. You could have died." Thomas looked up at her, his gray eyes startling against the black of his smoke-stained face. "The horses," he said hoarsely. "I could not let them burn." "And what about yourself?" She was sobbing now, all the fear and terror of the past few minutes pouring out of her. "What about the people who care about you? Did you think about that?" He reached up with one burned hand and touched her face, leaving a smudge of soot on her cheek. "You care about me. Of course I care about you, you idiot. I love you." The words were out before she could stop them, hanging in the smoke-filled air between them. Thomas stared at her, and for a moment, Zelda thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then he pulled her down to him and kissed her, desperate and fierce and tasting of smoke and ash. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough from smoke and emotion. "I have loved you since the day I saw you at the Holloway ranch, so brave and strong even when you were terrified. I have loved you every day since. I was just too afraid to say it." Zelda laughed and cried at the same time and kissed him again, softer this time, pouring all her feelings into it. Around them, the barn burned down to embers, but neither of them noticed. They only had eyes for each other. Mrs. Chen finally interrupted them, insisting that Thomas needed his burns tended to before they got infected. Zelda helped him to the house, and they spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, Mrs. Chen applying salve to his hands while Zelda held cool cloths to the burned places on his arms and face. "How did the fire start?" Zelda asked. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, cleared his throat. "I saw someone riding away as the fire was starting. Could not make out who it was in the dark, but it looked like they had deliberately set it." Thomas and Zelda exchanged a look, and she knew they were thinking the same thing. Marcus Holloway. He had not taken kindly to Thomas buying out her contract, and this was his revenge. "We cannot prove it was him," Thomas said tiredly. "And even if we could, he has the sheriff in his pocket. We will just have to be more vigilant from now on." The next weeks were busy as they worked to rebuild the barn before winter truly set in. Neighbors from the surrounding ranches came to help, and Zelda learned that Thomas was well respected in the community, known for his fairness and integrity. People remembered his mother's tragedy and admired how he had built something good from the ashes of his childhood. Through it all, Zelda and Thomas grew closer, stealing moments together whenever they could. A kiss in the hayloft while stacking the new hay. Holding hands as they walked to check on the cattle. Long conversations on the porch as the sun set, talking about their pasts and their hopes for the future. One evening in late November, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, Thomas asked her to take a walk with him. They bundled up in coats and scarves and walked down to the creek, which was running clear and cold over smooth stones. "I have been thinking," Thomas said, his breath misting in the cold air, "about what we talked about that night when the barn burned." Zelda's heart began to beat faster. "What about it?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know we have not known each other long. It has only been 2 months since I brought you here, but I feel like I have known you forever. You fit into my life like you were always meant to be part of it." He took a deep breath. "Zelda Carmichael, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Zelda felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." Thomas pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and snowflakes caught in their hair and melted on their warm skin. When they finally pulled apart, both laughing with happiness, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's," he said. "The only thing of hers I have left. I want you to have it." Zelda let him slide the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. She looked up at Thomas, at this good, brave man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, and felt her heart overflow with love. "When?" she asked. "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if the preacher can make it out here." He grinned, and she realized it was the first time she had seen him look truly, completely happy. "I have waited long enough for you. I do not want to wait another day." They married 3 days later in the parlor of the ranch house with Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands as witnesses, and a circuit preacher officiating. Zelda wore a dress that had belonged to Thomas's mother, carefully preserved all these years, and Thomas wore his Sunday best with his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed her, Zelda felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as if all the hardship and pain of the past months had been leading her to this moment, to this man, to this new life. That night, in the privacy of the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Thomas made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He touched her like she was precious, like she was a miracle he could not quite believe was real. And when they lay tangled together afterward, hearts still racing, he whispered against her hair all the things he loved about her, all the ways she had changed his life for the better. Zelda fell asleep in his arms, feeling safer and more loved than she had ever thought possible. Winter settled over the ranch in earnest after that, blanketing the valley in snow and keeping them close to home. But Zelda did not mind. She and Thomas spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and simply being together. They learned each other's rhythms, the small habits and preferences that make up a shared life. Thomas learned that Zelda liked to sing while she worked, that she had a gift for baking bread, that she was afraid of spiders but would not admit it. Zelda learned that Thomas was an early riser who liked his coffee black, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise, that he sometimes had nightmares about his mother's death and needed to be held until they passed. They also learned each other's bodies, discovering the ways they fit together, the touches that brought pleasure and the words that made them both feel cherished and desired. Their physical relationship deepened in parallel with their emotional connection, each aspect strengthening the other until Zelda could not imagine her life without him. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly with Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands, exchanging small gifts and sharing a feast that Zelda and Mrs. Chen had spent days preparing. Thomas gave Zelda a beautiful saddle made of tooled leather, and she gave him a vest she had sewn herself, working on it in secret whenever he was out of the house. As the new year of 1879 dawned, they made plans for the spring. Thomas wanted to expand the cattle operation, maybe add some sheep as well. Zelda wanted to start a garden to have fresh vegetables through the summer. They talked about building an addition onto the house, maybe starting a family in a year or two once they were more established, but their peace was not to last. In February, when the snow was still thick on the ground, Marcus Holloway came calling. Zelda was in the kitchen making bread when she heard horses in the yard. She looked out the window and felt her blood turn to ice. Holloway sat astride a massive black horse, flanked by 4 of his ranch hands, all armed. Thomas had been in the barn, but he emerged now, walking slowly toward Holloway with his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Zelda dried her hands and went to stand on the porch, and Mrs. Chen appeared beside her, her face grim. "You are not welcome here, Holloway," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I heard you married the girl," Holloway said. He looked past Thomas to where Zelda stood on the porch, and his smile made her skin crawl. "That is sweet, young love and all that. But we have unfinished business, you and I. We have no business at all. I disagree. See, you humiliated me, Kane. You came onto my property and made me look weak in front of my men. Then someone burned down your barn, which was unfortunate." The false sympathy in his voice made it clear he had been behind the fire. Things like that can keep happening. Accidents on a ranch are so common. The threat was clear. Thomas's hand moved fractionally closer to his gun. "If you come onto my property again, it will not end well for you." Big words from a man outnumbered. Holloway's hand moved toward his own weapon, and Zelda felt her heart stop. Then Mrs. Chen stepped forward, and she was holding Thomas's rifle, aimed directly at Holloway's chest. Not so outnumbered, the older woman said calmly. At the same moment, Pete and two other ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, all armed. They moved to flank Thomas, and suddenly the balance of power had shifted. Holloway's eyes darted from Thomas to Mrs. Chen to the ranch hands, calculating his odds. Finally, he raised his hand slowly. Easy now. No need for anyone to do something they will regret. Then I suggest you leave, Thomas said, and do not come back. Next time I will not ask Mrs. Chen to show such restraint. Holloway's face darkened with rage, but he was smart enough to know when he was beaten. He yanked his horse's reins around and kicked it into a gallop, his men following close behind. They watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge, and only then did everyone lower their weapons. Thomas turned to look at Zelda, and she saw the fear in his eyes that he had been hiding behind the bravado. She ran to him and he caught her, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I will not let him hurt you," Thomas said fiercely. "I swear it." But they both knew Holloway would not give up so easily. A man like that did not accept defeat. He would be back, and next time he might not come with just threats. They spent the next weeks on high alert, taking turns standing watch at night, keeping weapons close at hand. The tension was wearing on all of them, but Zelda refused to let fear rule her life. She had been a prisoner once, trapped by debt and circumstance. She would not be a prisoner again, not even a prisoner of her own terror. Then, in early March, word came through the town grapevine that Marcus Holloway had been arrested. Apparently, he had been involved in a scheme to rustle cattle from several neighboring ranches, and someone had finally gathered enough evidence to bring him to justice. With the federal marshal involved, even the corrupt local sheriff could not protect him. When Thomas brought the news home, Zelda felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Holloway would go to prison, probably for years. They were safe. That night, they celebrated with Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands, opening a bottle of whiskey that Thomas had been saving for a special occasion. They drank and laughed and told stories, and for the first time in months, Zelda felt like she could breathe freely again. Later, as she and Thomas lay in bed with the window open to let in the cool spring air, she said, "I want to have a baby." Thomas propped himself up on one elbow to look at her. "Are you sure? We talked about waiting." "I was afraid before. Afraid of bringing a child into a world where we might not be safe. But we are safe now, Thomas. Holloway is gone. We have a good life here, a good home. I want to share it with a family." He smiled and pulled her close, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then let us start working on that right now." She laughed and kissed him back, and they made love with a new kind of joy, not just for the pleasure of it, but with the hope and intention of creating something precious together. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The snow melted, revealing green grass and wildflowers. The cattle were driven to higher pastures as the weather warmed. Thomas and the ranch hands began work on the addition to the house, framing out 2 new rooms that would eventually be bedrooms for the children they hoped to have. And in early April, Zelda realized her monthly bleeding had not come. She waited another week to be sure, then another, and when the nausea hit her one morning as she was making breakfast, she knew. She told Thomas that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I am pregnant," she said simply, and watched his face transform with wonder and joy. "Truly," he put his hand on her still flat stomach, his palm warm through the fabric of her dress. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," she confirmed. And then she was laughing and crying at the same time as Thomas swept her into his arms and spun her around. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Zelda bloomed with health. her body adapting to the changes with surprising ease. Thomas was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about her working too hard or not eating enough, until she finally had to sit him down and gently tell him that she was pregnant, not made of glass, Mrs. Chen, who had delivered babies before, appointed herself as Zelda's midwife and advisor, sharing wisdom passed down through generations about what to expect and how to prepare. She knitted tiny clothes and blankets, her hands never idle, and Zelda felt grateful beyond words for the older woman's presence in her life. As her belly swelled and the baby began to move, Zelda would sometimes lie awake at night with Thomas's hand on her stomach, feeling their child kick and turn, and marvel at how much her life had changed in just over a year. She had gone from being a debt slave with no hope for the future to being a wife, a property owner, and soon a mother. She had gone from being utterly alone to being surrounded by people who cared for her, and at the center of it all was Thomas, her husband, her partner, her love. He was not a perfect man, but he was perfect for her. He made her laugh. He made her feel safe. He looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, even now when she was as big as a barn and could barely see her own feet. The baby came on a cold December night, 3 days before Christmas. Zelda's water broke while she was setting the table for dinner, and within an hour, the contractions had begun in earnest. Mrs. Chen took charge immediately, sending Thomas to boil water and fetch clean linens, turning the bedroom into a birthing room. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day. There were moments when Zelda thought she could not go on, when the pain was so intense she wanted to give up. But Thomas was there beside her the whole time, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, letting her squeeze his fingers until they turned white. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, with one final push that felt like it would tear her apart, their baby was born. The sound of the infant's first cry was the most beautiful thing Zelda had ever heard. "It is a boy," Mrs. Chen announced, placing the squalling, red-faced bundle on Zelda's chest. "A healthy boy." Zelda looked down at her son, at his tiny perfect fingers and his dark hair and his eyes that were trying to focus on her face, and felt love crash over her like a wave. Thomas leaned over them both, tears streaming down his face, and kissed her forehead. "He is perfect," Thomas said hoarsely. "You are amazing. You did so well." They named him Jacob after Thomas's father. Jacob Kane, born on December 22, 1879, weighing 7 pounds and already showing signs of his father's stubbornness and his mother's determination. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and overwhelming and more wonderful than Zelda could have imagined. Jacob was a good baby, sleeping reasonably well and nursing eagerly, but he still required constant attention. Zelda spent her days in a blur of feeding and changing and rocking, and she would not have traded it for anything. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, getting up in the middle of the night to bring Jacob to Zelda for feeding, walking the floor with the baby when he was fussy, making funny faces to elicit those precious early smiles. Watching him with their son made Zelda fall in love with him all over again. As winter gave way to spring and Jacob grew from a newborn into a chubby, gurgling infant, life settled into a new rhythm. The ranch prospered. The cattle herd grew. The garden Zelda had planted flourished. And in the evenings, they would sit on the porch as a family, watching the sun set over the valley while Jacob babbled and played, and Zelda would think about how far she had come. Sometimes she would think about that day at the Holloway ranch when Thomas had handed her the contract and told her to burn it. That single act of kindness had changed everything. It had given her back her freedom, yes, but more than that, it had given her a future. On their second wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised her with a gift. It was a deed, legally drawn up and notarized, that put the ranch in both their names. "This is your home," he said. "Not because you married me, but because you helped build it. Everything I have is yours, Zelda. I want that to be official." She cried, of course, because she seemed to cry at everything these days, and she kissed him and told him he was the best man she had ever known. The years that followed were good ones. Jacob grew into a bright, energetic toddler with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. When he was 2, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she carried a girl they named Sarah, born in the spring of 1882 with a full head of red hair that neither parent could account for, and a set of lungs that could be heard across the valley. Life was not without its challenges. There were years when the cattle prices were low and money was tight. There were seasons of drought that had them all praying for rain. There were illnesses and injuries and the normal trials of raising children and running a ranch. But they faced all of it together, and somehow that made even the hard times bearable. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1885, and they buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley she had loved. Zelda mourned her deeply, grateful for the older woman's kindness and wisdom, knowing she would have never made it through those early days without her. They hired a young couple to help with the house and the ranch work, and life continued its steady march forward. Jacob started school in Coloma, riding in with Thomas once a week to attend classes. Sarah proved to be as headstrong as her mother, refusing to wear dresses and insisting on following her father and brother everywhere they went. In 1887, Zelda gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Michael and David. The birth was difficult, and afterward the doctor told them there would be no more children. Zelda felt a pang of sadness at this news, but when she looked at her 4 healthy children and her loving husband, she knew she had been blessed beyond measure. The years turned like pages in a book. The children grew. Jacob became a serious young man who wanted to be a lawyer, much to Thomas's surprise and pride. Sarah remained a tomboy who could rope a calf as well as any ranch hand. The twins were inseparable, always getting into some kind of mischief. Thomas's hair started to gray at the temples, and lines appeared around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Zelda found her own silver threads appearing in her dark hair, and there were mornings when her back ached from years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the same people who had fallen in love in the shadow of tragedy and built something beautiful together. On a warm summer evening in 1895, they sat on the porch as they had 1,000 times before, watching the sun set over the valley. The children were inside, Jacob helping the twins with their reading while Sarah worked on her embroidery with exaggerated sighs of frustration. It was a rare moment of peace, and Zelda leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder, content. "You ever think about how we met?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Every day," he said finally. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you if I had not heard about Holloway buying that contract, if I had not had the money to buy it from him, if you had decided to leave and go somewhere else instead of staying here." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were serious. "My whole life would be different. Everything good I have comes from that choice to ride to the Holloway ranch that day." "I think about it too," Zelda said. "I was so certain my life was over. I thought I would die in that place, or something inside me would die even if my body survived. And then you appeared and gave me back my freedom." She smiled. "You gave me everything, Thomas. Hope and love and a family and a home. How do I ever thank you for that? You do not need to thank me." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over the gold band she still wore, his mother's ring that had never left her finger in all these years. "You saved me too, Zelda. I was so lonely before you came. I had built this ranch, built a life, but it was empty. You filled it with love and laughter and purpose. You gave me a reason to get up in the morning beyond just the work. You gave me a family." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I love you more now than I did on the day we married, and I loved you pretty desperately even then." Zelda felt tears prick at her eyes, and she laughed at herself. "You would think after all these years I would stop crying every time you say something sweet. I hope you never stop." He pulled her closer, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they heard Sarah shriek with laughter and Jacob's deeper voice telling her to settle down. The sounds of their children, of their life together, surrounded them like a warm blanket. Zelda thought about the contract she had signed all those years ago, the document that had tried to define her as property, as something to be owned. She thought about watching it burn, the ashes scattering on the wind, taking her bondage with them. And she thought about how that moment had been both an ending and a beginning, the last moment of her old life and the first moment of everything that came after. She had been sold to a brutal rancher. A cowboy had bought her contract and handed it to her to burn, and in doing so, he had given her something infinitely more valuable than freedom. He had given her love, true and lasting and strong enough to build a life on. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they finally went inside to where their children were waiting, to the house they had built together, to the life they had made from ash and hope and stubborn determination. Zelda looked around at the family gathered in the warm lamplight, at Thomas smiling as he helped Michael sound out a difficult word, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. They had been through so much together, she and Thomas. They had faced down bullies and started with nothing and built something lasting. They had created a home where their children could grow up safe and loved. They had made a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rare things in any time but especially in the rough frontier of the 1870s and 1880s. And through it all, through every challenge and triumph, they had chosen each other. Every single day they woke up and chose to love each other, to support each other, to build their life together. That choice, made over and over again, was what had carried them through. Years later, when Jacob brought home his own bride, when Sarah married a neighboring rancher's son despite being nearly 30 and thoroughly set in her independent ways, when the twins took over more and more of the ranch operations, Zelda and Thomas found themselves with time to simply be together. They would take long rides through the valley, just the two of them, and Thomas would point out changes in the landscape, new growth, places where they had made their mark. They would visit Mrs. Chen's grave and tell her about the family, knowing she would have been proud. They would sit on the porch in the evenings and watch their grandchildren play in the yard, their hearts full. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that brought together friends and neighbors from all over the county. There was music and dancing and a feast that lasted well into the night. At one point, as Zelda danced with Thomas under the stars, she looked around at all the people who had come to celebrate with them and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Happy?" Thomas asked, pulling her closer. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she answered honestly. And it was true. The scared young woman who had signed away 7 years of her life to pay her father's debts would never have believed this future was possible. She would never have imagined that kindness could come from unexpected places, that love could grow from the ashes of trauma, that freedom given freely could be the foundation of something so strong and lasting. But Zelda had learned that life could surprise you in the best possible ways. She had learned that the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes. She had learned that one person choosing to do the right thing, to show compassion when they could have shown cruelty, could change the entire trajectory of a life. Thomas had been that person for her. He had seen someone in need and helped without thought of reward or return. He had given her back her freedom when he could have kept it. He had treated her with respect and kindness when the world would have supported him doing otherwise. And in return, she had given him her heart, her loyalty, her partnership in building a life neither of them could have created alone. As the party wound down and their children and grandchildren headed home or settled into spare rooms for the night, Zelda and Thomas found themselves alone on the porch once more, the place where so much of their life together had unfolded. "You have any regrets?" Zelda asked, a question that had been on her mind lately as they both entered their later years. Thomas considered this seriously. "I regret that my mother did not live to see what I built. I regret that I could not save her the way I saved you. But as for us, for our life together, not a single regret." "You?" Zelda shook her head. "Not one. Even the hard parts led us here, and I would not trade here for anything." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the moon rise over the valley that had been their home for so many years. And Zelda thought about how strange and wonderful it was that the worst day of her life, the day she thought she had lost everything, had actually been the beginning of everything good that followed. She had been sold to a brutal rancher. A cowboy had bought her contract and handed it to her to burn. And in that simple act of kindness, he had set in motion a love story that would last a lifetime and beyond. As she drifted off to sleep that night in Thomas's arms, Zelda smiled, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, just as they always had. Their love had been tested by hardship and strengthened by time, and it would endure as long as they both drew breath. And when, many years later, they were both laid to rest side by side on the hillside next to Mrs. Chen, overlooking the valley they had loved, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them. They told stories about the grandfather who had saved a woman from servitude and married her for love, and about the grandmother who had survived against all odds and built a legacy of strength and compassion. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. But it all started with that moment in 1878 when Thomas Kane handed Zelda Carmichael a contract and told her she was free. That moment of grace, of seeing another person's humanity and acting to preserve it, had rippled out across decades, shaping not just two lives but an entire family tree. And somewhere, Zelda liked to think, her father and Thomas's mother were watching and smiling, knowing that their children had found in each other exactly what they needed. Knowing that love, real love built on respect and partnership and genuine care, could overcome even the darkest circumstances. Knowing that their struggles had not been in vain, because they had led to this beautiful, complicated, perfectly imperfect life. The story of how Zelda and Thomas fell in love was told and retold, becoming family legend. The contract that Thomas had burned became a symbol of the family's values, a reminder that people were more important than property, that compassion mattered more than profit, that doing the right thing, even when it cost you something, was always worth it. And so the love story that began in the Wild West, in a time of rough justice and rougher living, became a legacy that outlived them both. It became proof that even in the hardest times, even when systems of power tried to reduce people to commodities, individual acts of kindness and love could make all the difference. Zelda had been sold to a brutal rancher. Thomas had bought her contract and handed it to her to burn. And from those ashes rose a love that would never be forgotten, a family that would thrive for generations, and a story that proved that freedom and love, once given freely, could change the world.